What do you do when a river you've loved your whole life turns against you, flooding your home and bringing up secrets that could ruin the brother you once trusted? My name is Evie Thornton, and I live in a small house by the river just outside Memphis, Tennessee, where the rain came down hard that spring night. The storm roared loud and shook my old home to its bones. I couldn't sleep through the noise, so I stayed awake, listening to the water pound the walls. Then the Mississippi broke its banks and rushed inside, cold and muddy, spilling under my door. I grabbed my cane and waded through it to save what mattered. I pulled photo albums, Mama's quilt, and bits of a life my brother Carl had left me to hold together. This house wasn't just a place to live for me. It stood as my fight after Carl took everything else. In 1972, when Daddy's heart stopped and Mama passed a year later, he turned on me. We grew up here, two kids playing by the river, chasing crawfish in the mud. I did the chores while he told stories about getting rich quick. I stayed after they died and worked the land to keep it going. Carl tricked me and said they'd willed it all to him. He pushed me out with a smile I'd never forget. I moved into this shack by the water, a corner he didn't want, while he took the acres that belonged to us both. I hadn't gone near the cellar since then because its damp walls held Mama's last days too close, and I'd let it sit untouched. The flood came strong and filled that cellar I'd ignored. I made myself go down, splashing through the water to a trunk Daddy had built. The trunk tipped over and spilled out linens. Then a loud clang stopped me. I saw a small rusted safe stuck in a corner where Carl used to keep his things. My hands shook as I pulled it up, the storm howling outside. I broke it open with a crowbar until the lid popped loose. Inside were papers, yellowed and wet, showing titles and deeds in Daddy's strong writing and Mama's shaky hand. I looked close in the dim light, my heart racing fast. Carl's name was scribbled over theirs, dates changed to 1972. He had forged it and stolen our land with a lie, hiding it where he knew I'd never look. Lightning lit up the sky, and the river roared louder. I gripped those papers, anger rising like the water. Carl lived big now with a fancy house in Memphis and plenty of money, while I fixed leaks and struggled through winters. The family, my cousins and relatives, had told me, "Let it go, Evie. He's your brother." But this was different. This was betrayal written in ink, stored where Mama's memory stayed, a spot he knew I'd avoid. I carried the safe upstairs, water swirling at my knees, and laid the deeds out like a plan in the flickering light. He'd built his life on my loss, but this flood had dug up his crime. I'd use it to make him pay. I wasn't out for revenge, just an old woman with a river's fury and a sister's score to settle for breaking our roots. The Memphis dawn came gray and heavy the next day, the river's muddy hold loosening from my house. But those papers from Daddy's safe burned brighter than the storm's damage. I had grown up on this land with Carl, my younger brother, two kids with dirt under our nails from the riverbank. I hoed the fields while he sat by the water, dreaming of easy money. I was 16 when Daddy taught me to plow, and I was 20 when Mama showed me the family ledger. Carl liked to talk big with quick smiles and excuses, skipping work while I kept things running. In 1972, when Daddy died and Mama followed a year later, I stayed to tend the land through my sadness. Carl turned against me and claimed they'd signed it all to him, leaving me with nothing but a handshake and his lie. Now, soaked from the flood, I spread the deeds across my table, water dripping to the floor. They proved Carl had faked the will and taken acres Mama meant for both of us. I had moved to this shack by the river after he pushed me out, a forgotten spot he didn't care about, while he sold our fields for cash and built a life I couldn't touch. I had heard rumors of his big house and shiny car, but I never had proof until now. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and called Carla, my lawyer friend from church. I said, I found papers. Carl faked the will and stole the land. Can we fight him? She paused and answered, send them to me. Forgery's strong evidence if we can prove it. I mailed the papers and wrote Carl a note with a steady hand. I found your lie. The land's mine too. Face me. His reply came quick, a letter full of scorn. Evie, you're chasing ghosts. The land's sold, and the money's gone. Cry to your river, old woman. I'm untouchable. I crumpled it, his laugh from 1972 ringing in my ears. That grin he wore when he waved me off. I thought, untouchable? Not anymore. The river spoke, and I'll drag you down. Carla called that night with a crisp voice. The deeds hold up. Carl forged them and sold to a real estate firm in 1973. He's rich off it now and owns half of Memphis. My chest tightened. I asked, half of Memphis from my work. She said, there's more. I found tax records. He dodged liens and hid cash. Keep looking. I went back to the cellar where the floodwater had dropped and pulled up Mama's trunk again. Inside were letters, ledgers, and a note in her hand. In 1971, Carl took $50. He thought I wouldn't notice. I hope Evie holds it. She's the spine. My eyes stung. She had seen his flaws and trusted me to stand strong. I paced the room, the river's murmur steady outside. He had played us all, me, Mama, Daddy, for years, his charm hiding greed. In 1971, I had caught him taking coins from her purse and laughed when he called it a loan. But Mama's frown stayed with me. Now his betrayal cut deep, a hurt growing for 50 years. The family had said, he's kin, Evie, but this kin had drained us dry. I'd fight, not for hate, but for her, for justice, for the land he'd turned to mud. The river had given me the truth, and I'd use it until he sank in his own mess. The Memphis sun burned hot the day I faced Carl, 1 week after the floodwaters pulled back from my riverside house. I drove to his big mansion with tall white columns and glass windows shining, a place he built with my stolen years. Mama's deeds and Carla's legal proof sat in my bag, ready to show him up. I climbed his steps slowly, my cane hitting hard against the stone, determined to rip away his lies. He opened the door wide with slick silver hair and a clean suit, grinning like he did in 1972. He said, Evie, did you come to whine about your swamp? I heard the river got wild. I stepped inside and replied with a cold voice, it's not the river, it's your lies. You forged Mama's will and stole our land. I have the truth here. I dropped the deeds on his table, his name scratched over hers with dates twisted to 1972. His grin froze, and his eyes flicked to the papers. He said, you're grabbing at nothing. These mean nothing. I sold the land and the money's mine. I pushed Carla's report toward him and said, you sold it? You faked it. Witnesses and notary records prove it. You're finished, Carl. Admit it. He snatched the papers and read them fast, then laughed loud and wild. He shouted, finished? I'm untouchable. I sold it fair, built this. Sue me, Evie. I'll sue you back and drag you through court until you're broke. The air grew tight, his threat swelling like a storm, but I stood firm. I said, broke? You broke Mama. You took her trust and left me scraps. Why did you do it? He paced the room, and his voice rose higher. Scraps? You got her pity. I got nothing. Mama babied you and called you the rock while she sighed at me. I had to take it and prove I was more. His fists clenched, old anger pouring out. I stood still, shocked. 50 years of bitterness had festered since he was a boy in my shadow. Voices broke in as my cousins arrived. I had called Carla, and she rallied them. Mary, my cousin, stood behind me and said, "She's right, Carl. You cheated us." Tom, another cousin, hesitated and said, "He's blood, Evie. Drop it." The room split with shouts flying. Carl yelled, "I'll bury you all. Courts will see my side and my money." Mary snapped back, "Money? You'll choke on it." He lunged and shouted, "I'll fight until you're broke. Watch me." Then Carla's call came through on my phone, clear and sharp. She said, "Evie, his buyer from 1973, that real estate firm? They went bankrupt and sued Carl for fraud over a loan tied to that land. He owes millions. He has nothing left." I fumbled the phone, papers falling, and grinned. "I'm still clumsy. Guess your big house is mud now." His laugh stopped, and his face twisted. He yelled, "Millions? They're lying. I'll sue them back and prove it's mine." He grabbed his phone and dialed fast, but Mary picked up the deeds and said, "Lying? You're sunk. The river judged you." The lawyer paled and muttered, "Fraud's clear. The loan's real. He's out." Carl staggered, his defiance crumbling into panic as kin turned away. His throne became a ruin. The river hadn't just flooded. It had sentenced him, and I stood tall, justice won without a strike. The Memphis twilight settled gentle as Carl's world fell apart, the river's muddy grip loosening from my house like a tide turning away. Carla's work struck hard. The real estate firm from 1973, broken and angry, took him to court over a loan built on his lies. Weeks later, I watched from town. A black car cornered him outside a bar, and two men in suits shook him down. His voice rang shrill as they took his keys. Creditors stripped away his mansion, cars, and accounts, and by summer, he was a shadow living in a cheap downtown room. I took back the land with legal deeds now clear, split it with Mary and the kin who stood by me, and sold pieces to fix my home, a piece of Mama's trust reborn. He came at dusk, knocking weak on my door, his suit gone for a worn jacket, his eyes sunken. He said, "Evie, I'm finished. Lawsuits and debts took it all. Please help me." I stood in the doorway with the river calm behind me and Mama's quilt over my chair. I replied, "Help you? You forged our blood and sold our roots. Why should I help?" He sank to the steps and muttered, "I was wrong. I thought I'd rise and be more than you. I lost everything." I watched him, his plea a faint shadow of his 1972 swagger. I said, "You rose on my back. Reap it now." He nodded, broken. Mama saw it. She knew I'd fall. He shuffled away, a shell of the brother I'd raised, and I closed the door as peace filled the room. Carla called and said, "He's bankrupt. Fraud charges stick. The land's yours, all clear." I murmured, "Good. Let it end." Mary visited, her voice soft. "He's wrecked, Evie. Does it feel right?" I sighed. "It's not joy, just calm. Mama made it happen." In 1971, she had caught him taking coins and pulled me aside. She said, "He'll take until he breaks, Evie. Forgive him, but hold strong. You're my strength." I had laughed it off then, but she'd planted justice deep. That night, I walked the riverbank with the water clear and my house standing firm against its flow. Carl's taunt stayed with me. 1965, me working beside Mama while he sulked because she praised my grit. I had thought it was love, not jealousy, but he'd twisted it into theft, a hurt growing for 50 years. I forgave him, not for him, but for me, to let go of his weight. I stood there as creditors circled his rented room, a man begging shadows. The land stretched wide, ours again, and I smiled, feeling Mama's quiet victory. The river mud had cleared, leaving truth. Ever see a thief drown in the mess he made without you lifting a hand? That's her gift. Justice runs deep, a reckoning as sure as the river's tide.